At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
This is your before and after story, where your first steps towards a new life-changing career begin. Southeastern College can take you there. We offer in-demand hybrid and online programs with hands-on training, led by in-field career professionals, and career services to put you on the path to a rewarding and fulfilling future. This is where your transformation begins. Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sec.edu to get started.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
We do thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on VCY America. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time of contrast. I mean, that which is good is called evil. That which is evil is called good. Darkness is considered light. Light is darkness. Bitter is sweet. Sweet is bitter. You know, the prophet Isaiah gave a troubling woe to those who take such a position. On yet another example of this, the Bible tells us that parents, particularly fathers, are to bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And yet the United Nations is wanting to usurp this mandate to bring your children up in the ways of the world, or what they would deem to be the global good. It's they who are demanding globalized control over your children, over the realm of education. It's a direct attack on parental rights. It's an attack on Scripture. It's a direct attack on national sovereignty and a direct attack on our Constitution. Joining us today, we welcome back Alex Newman. Alex is an award-winning international freelance journalist. He is also a researcher, an author, an educator, a consultant, senior editor for The New American, and a co-author of Crimes of the Educators. He's also written Deep State, the Invisible Government, and the Government Behind the Scenes, and Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. He's founder and CEO of Liberty Sentinel and a national syndicator of radio and TV programs, including Behind the Deep State, which airs on WVCY television and VCY.tv. Alex, thanks for joining us today.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So the United Nations has the educational system of the U.S. in their crosshairs, and it really isn't just the U.S., it's the educational system of the world, Alex, but the U.S. in particular has been a real burr in their saddle. Why is our educational system being targeted?
Well, the educational systems of the entire world, as you alluded to, Jim, are in the crosshairs of the UN. I mean, in essence, the UN wants a one-world educational system to go with the one-world political, economic, and even religious system that they're trying to impose on humanity. And they understand that education is the key to all of it. Right? People talk about culture being upstream from politics, and that's absolutely true, but education is upstream from culture. And so if you look at the UN's own documents, if you go back to 1992 when they created Agenda 21, they say that education is critical, it's indispensable for changing people's attitudes and values to make them agree with all of this. So the UN's been very open about why they feel they need to get control of education globally to advance this agenda. And now when it comes to the United States in particular, they're especially upset with us because even though the U.S. government has signed on to all these international treaties and agreements and conventions, at least most of them, I should say, they acknowledge in this report after their investigation of the United States that we still have a 10th Amendment to the Constitution and that a lot of power over education is still retained by state and local authorities. And that means the federal government cannot just enforce the UN's agenda on our government schools, at least not as overtly. And so they're very upset with the U.S. because we don't have enough LGBT, we don't have enough DEI, at least in certain states. And so they say that to comply with these international mechanisms, the U.S. government is going to have to work harder to impose these things on our schools.
So the United Nations has, a so-called Human Rights Council. We're going to talk about who they sent to the United States and so forth in just a moment. But this is really just another contradiction, isn't it? I mean, isn't the so-called Human Rights Council supporting many organizations that actually abuse human rights?
There's no question about it. And this has been the case with the UN from the beginning, right? They actually had to finally disband their they call it the UN Human Rights Commission, because Muammar Gaddafi ended up in charge of it. I mean, Muammar Gaddafi was a mass-murdering Islamo-socialist, and so that just looked really, really awkward. But if you look at the governments that are on the UN Human Rights Council today, we have the exact same problem. You've got the regime in Cuba, for example, holds a seat on this thing. You've got various Islamist dictatorships from northern Africa. You've got Algeria. You've got Sudan, right, which is literally run by an Islamist mass-murdering organization that has been slaughtering Christians. So you've got a lot of these nasty mass-murderous governments sitting on this thing. And then if you look at what the UN means when it talks about human rights, I think this is really critical for people to understand. They don't mean what Americans normally think of as rights. You know, we in America, we value rights. In fact, our country was founded on the biblical principle that our founding fathers said was a self-evident truth, that God gave us rights, and the governments are instituted to protect those rights. When the UN talks about rights, they mean something very different, and they make this clear in their own documents. If you read, for example, the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, they say that your so-called rights can be restricted or limited based on public order or basically any pretext at all. And they even say in Article 29 that you can never use your rights and freedoms contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN, which essentially makes the entire set of quote-unquote rights given to you by government completely meaningless. So they mean something very different than we do, and we need to understand that when we get involved with these things.
We really do. And Alex, many are not aware of this, but this Human Rights Council actually sent an individual here to the United States to examine our educational system. Are we lining up with the UN? Are we lining up with their goals? And we'll talk about their report in just a moment, but let's first of all speak of who they sent. I mean, is it Farida Shahid? And I was looking at the UN Human Rights page. She's a sociologist, executive director of Pakistan's leading gender justice organization. One of her focuses is that of non-binary and how that identifies, among other things. I mean, couldn't we say that the person they sent to examine us is really like a DEI envoy?
Absolutely, and I would encourage people to look at this lady, and this is very representative of the kind of people who go work to the UN. Farida Shahid, her name, is a radical feminist. She comes from, of course, an Islamic background, and that shows she's very, very obviously biased against Israel, appears to be very biased against the Jews. She was asked recently about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism? I don't see any anti-Semitism. So, totally oblivious to that. Globalist to the core, radical left-wing. And if you look at her criticisms of the United States and other interviews that she's given, even in recent years, what's very clear is that she thoroughly and firmly believes that the entire education system of the world needs to basically line up with what the UN is dictating, and she's very open about the fact that she thinks that applies to private schools as well. And so we're talking here about a radical activist who has a fancy job title with the UN. Her title is Special Rapporteur for the UN on the Right to Education, and we can get into what that means. Mm-hmm. But essentially, it's a very powerful post with a very nice title. But when you look at who she is, really what she brings to the table is radical activism that clearly does not line up with American values and certainly not our Constitution.
Alex Newman is our guest here today on Crosstalk. And Alex, I'm looking at the report. They just released this during the 59th session of the Human Rights Council, June 16th to July 11, according to the report. And they said this: their aim of the visit to the U.S. was to gather firsthand information on the provision and enjoyment of the right to free, quality, and inclusive education for all, and to engage in a dialogue with and offer recommendations to the government and other stakeholders in this regard. Now, Alex, that sentence alone needs to be unpacked. Share with us what they're meaning by that sentence.
Well, one of the really important things to start with is this whole idea of the right to a quality, inclusive, equitable education that she's referring to. Now, one of her final recommendations to the United States is that the federal and state governments recognize a so-called human right to a quality, inclusive, and equitable education. And it goes back to what we were just discussing with the UN's conception of human rights, which is very, very different than ours. See, in the American system, education is a responsibility. And throughout the Western world, for virtually all of history, and this comes straight out of the Bible, education has been seen as a responsibility of parents, not a right that the government bestows on you. And there's a very important distinction. And so if you go back for a moment to the UN's Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 26 is one of the ones that deals with this subject. There's a couple of really interesting things in there. One of the things you'll notice is that education shall be compulsory. In other words, the government must force you to receive this education. And then right underneath that, it says that your education shall further the activities and the goals of the United Nations. And right off the bat, that tells you something very important, right? I homeschool my 6 children. My wife and I homeschool, and we don't further the activities of the UN through our homeschool. And so in the eyes of the UN, we would then be depriving our children of the human right to education because we teach them the truth about the UN. We teach them the truth about the UN's history. So this is very problematic for many, many reasons. This lady was invited here by the Biden administration, and we can talk more about her recommendations and her findings, but essentially she is upset with us for not doing exactly what the UN wants on education.
And there's been a number of states that have been active, as we know, striking down the LGBT agenda, the genderqueer emphasized education, and she really takes direct aim at this. And matter of fact, she talks about when states protect their children from this indoctrination, she's calling it censorship.
Yes, and in fact, she's very critical of what she describes as the book bans as well. And so we have, as you know, a number of states in this country, including my state of Florida, and I worked on some of these efforts. The state of Texas has also done these things to try to get the LGBT propaganda, the DEI propaganda, the racialism, all this stuff out of the classroom. One of the laws she specifically condemns is one that we passed in Florida that the media very inaccurately referred to as the Don't Say Gay bill. All it said is that teachers are not supposed to be talking to children below 4th grade about homosexuality and transgenderism and all these kinds of things, which seems like a pretty reasonable request to me. I mean, I would say that not just 4th grade and below, but we got to go higher than that. That's not the job of the government to be teaching our children homosexuality and gender confusion. But, of course, she regards that as censorship and book banning and claims that it is contrary to the policies that the U.S. government has agreed to implement and support through these UN mechanisms.
So just so that we don't have some people tuning out and say, well, that's why I go to choose, the homeschooling, or that's why I choose private education. The Human Rights Division, UN, and this person in particular has their sights on more than what is just classified under the topic of public education or government education, but private education is in their crosshairs as well. Matter of fact, her report says the growing privatization of education threatens the integrity of public schooling.
That's right. And you see, the UN Human Rights Council has been openly beating the war drums on this issue for over a decade. In fact, in 2015, I did an article for the New American where they publicly said, the UN Human Rights Council voted, and they passed a resolution that said all schools, including private schools, must implement these directives in terms of what is taught, the standards that are used, the curricula that is used. They must be supervised and monitored by governments. And so the UN's plan, and they don't even hide it anymore, the UN's plan is that all education providers, including private schools, including homeschooling to the extent that it's even allowed, and I think very soon here we're going to see the UN launch a crusade against home education as well, but all education must teach what the UN wants. And when they say you have a human right to a quote-unquote quality and inclusive and equitable education, they define quality and inclusive and equitable much differently than, say, a Christian in Wisconsin or Kentucky or Illinois would. And they are absolutely coming for our private schools, our Christian schools, and our home schools, and they're doing it openly at this point.
Friends, the Biden administration invited the UN in to examine our education system, and they did, and they are coming back with some pretty horrendous recommendations for the educational system of the United States. I mean, from the earliest education all the way up through our colleges and universities as well. We'll be talking about those recommendations after the break. You're listening to Crosstalk.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation author with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, was Genesis written as poetry?
No, it wasn't, Chris, but this has been a favorite claim of liberals, subtly indicating that Genesis was a work of art and not meant to be taken as literal history. But this has been shown to be false. At the Institute for Creation Research, we've investigated this claim. It was found by statistical analysis of the verb tenses used in the Genesis account of creation that it's about the least poetic passage in all the Old Testament. It was written as sober narrative history and was meant to be understood by its readers as history. Of course, even if it were poetry, it doesn't mean it's not to be believed. Who says God can't write with flair? But he wrote Genesis as a sober historical account, and we need to believe it as such. Let's go back to Genesis and get it right.
For more on the foundational principles set forth in Genesis, visit us on the web at www.icr.org.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman is with us today. Alex is an award-winning international freelance journalist, senior editor for The New American. Matter of fact, Alex, you've written on this topic in the early July issue of The New American, dealing, and that's the headline, UN slams Trump on education demands globalized control. Just give us further word about The New American, if you would.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. So The New American's been around as long as I have. I consider it the best magazine in the world for information that you're not going to find elsewhere. Information on what the government is up to, what's going on at the international level, issues affecting the church, and our freedoms. The motto is that freedom shall not perish. So we do have a bias. The difference between us and many of the others is that we are just open and acknowledge our bias, whereas the others pretend like they don't have one, and then they market tyranny and left-wing extremism to you. So that's kind of what we do, and it's a monthly magazine now. We just recently switched to monthly from twice a month, but the issue is now twice the size, so we're just trying a different format. But I would really encourage people who want to stay informed, and I do think we should be informed, go check it out. You can get the online articles are free at the website, thenewamerican.com. We also have free daily emails that we send out to people who sign up, just with the most important news of the day. But then the print magazine is where the really in-depth investigative reporting goes. I mean, I go to the UN climate conferences and share with the folks what's going on. We've got some of the greatest writers in this country talking about some of the most important issues, and I would encourage people to check it out. It's at thenewamerican.com.
Also, just give us a word about Liberty Sentinel.
That's my personal operation, libertysentinel.org. I started that up as a college newspaper when I was in college, and it has since grown into to much more than that. And one of the big things that we do, in addition to the various shows that we do, is a free newsletter, and people can subscribe to that at libertysentinel.org. It's free. It comes out usually about 2 times per week, and again, aims to keep people up to speed on the most important issues affecting Christians and the church, all obviously from a biblical perspective.
So again, libertysentinel.org and thenewamerican.com. Alex Newman with us here today. So this Farida Shaheed was a rapporteur that came to the United States at the request of the Biden administration and visited Washington, D.C., and then also the states of Colorado and Indiana, examining our education system, and went from A to Z, really up through the university level as well, Alex. And she came away with some recommendations that we need to put into practice here for our educational system. And there's a number of them, but what stands out to you as being the most alarming?
Well, there are so many that I think would alarm Americans. I mean, starting with the idea that we need more federal control over our education system. I don't think that's in line with, first of all, our Constitution, which is still the supreme law of the land when it comes to our legal code here in this country. There's a reason our founding fathers did not include education as one of the powers of Congress, because they never expected that the federal government would be involved in the education of children. Biblically speaking, that is an issue for parents, and if they want to delegate some of that out, that's within their purview. But this is not even a government responsibility, certainly not a federal responsibility, contrary to what Ms. Farida Shahid claims. She also argues that we have an obligation to allow these pro-Palestine, so-called pro-Hamas riots on our college campuses.
Yep.
Claims that that our states have no authority to try to interfere with these really radical operations, in some cases supported by foreign governments. She calls for more DEI and race and gender and sex information in the classroom. She calls, one of the ones that was really shocking to me is that even the international agreements that we have not signed up to yet, she says we should be signing up to them. And one of the ones that I think is worth mentioning, Jim, that she specifically cites is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Yes.
So this is an international treaty. We have not signed up for it, right? Our senators looked at this and said, nope, the United States is not going to be participating in this. And to give people a little sense of what it's about, it claims to support the rights of children. And in this treaty, it says that all decisions must be made in the best interest of the child. But here's the catch. It's not parents who will be deciding what is in the best interest of the child. It is government that will decide what's in the best interest of the child. And so when this was implemented in Scotland, was one of the first countries that really started implementing this, you can read the implementing legislation. They actually assigned a government bureaucrat to every child born in Scotland to oversee their development, to check in on the child, to make sure the parents were doing what the government wanted with the education and the upbringing of that child. So these are radical policy recommendations coming from this UN Special Rapporteur, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, Jim. There's so much more.
And there is much more, and it goes several pages here. And I found this to be interesting. She said, where school resource officers remain in place, and because they're all about removing police presence and consider what she calls through gender societal dialogue, how to improve safety in the schools. And where school resource officers remain in place, they must be trained in the rights of the child. Racial equality, implicit bias, non-discrimination standards, trauma-related behavioral responses, and the prevention of child abuse and sexual misconduct. The use of restraints and arrest should only be employed as last resort, and she goes on from there. But everything is about the rights of the child.
Yeah, and when you read what the UN considers to be a right of a child, it starts getting really extreme. I mean, some of the stuff is so extreme we can't even talk about it on the radio, Jim. It involves sexuality and children, but the UN essentially claims, and through multiple organizations, agencies, and instruments, that children have a right to sexual activity if it's consensual, and they have a right to seek out information on this, which has been interpreted to mean they have a right to access pornography. I mean, these things are not acceptable. These things are way, way out there, and certainly most Americans would not agree with these things. But this is the kind of stuff the UN is pushing under the guise of the rights of children. And so parents need to be warned, and they need to be aware that the UN is doing this as we speak.
She is also calling for the reinstatement of affirmative action in college admissions.
Yep. And, again, the Supreme Court has spoken on this. Our policymakers, our legislators have spoken on this. We're not interested in having, racialized admissions processes. We don't want people to be discriminated against based on their skin color. And yet the UN is coming in here and ordering us to do this, which is, it's hard to overstate how improper and inappropriate this is.
She says to treat education as a public good, and then she says this, and again ties in with the private schooling and also homeschooling, Alex, because it says public schools should not be obliged to compete with each other or with private and semi-private options as they perform a fundamental role of education and educating the whole nation, especially the most marginalized, for a public good. This requires a change of mindset and collective action across all sectors.
Yeah, and there's a lot to break down right there, Jim, but I'll start with the whole idea of a public good. I taught economics for 12 years through the Freedom Project Academy, and in the world of economics, public goods are a topic of discussion. A public good is typically defined within economics as a good that's non-rival and non-excludable. Think, for example, a lighthouse. It's non-rival in that whether you have one ship or 10 ships or 100 ships enjoying the benefits of that light, the enjoyment by one of those ships of that light doesn't interfere with the enjoyment of the other ships of that light. So it's not like a hamburger where when one person eats the hamburger, nobody else can eat the hamburger. So it's non-rival, and it's non-excludable, which means people cannot be excluded from benefiting from it, right? You can't turn off the lighthouse for some ships and turn it on for others because some paid the fee and some didn't. So in no way is education does it actually fit the criteria inherent in a public good. But what happens with public goods is then the governments use that as a rationale to expand into something and to totally control something. And that's what they want done here with education. They essentially want the government to have a total monopoly on the education and the upbringing of children, and they want it to be completely in line with what they themselves have decreed needs to be part of a quality and inclusive education, which, again, is not in line with American values. It's not in line with the Bible, certainly, and it's not in line with what we in America have understood as being education for hundreds of years.
In the report also, Alex, she makes several references to competent mental health and having competent mental health staff address the diverse needs of students. Mental health comes up in many places in this report itself, and yet we destroy young people's mental health when we teach them the whole, boys can be girls, girls can be boys, etc. We bring confusion, but comment on this aspect of mental health because it's an emphasis we're hearing more and more in our society today as well.
It is, and there are a number of really significant dangers here with this push for mental health. The first one, there's a lot of evil that passes under the guise of mental health, right? There's a lot of drugging of children with these dangerous psychotropic drugs that are marketed as supposed cures or treatments for alleged mental health issues. But if you really dig into what the UN is trying to do with mental health, the simplest way to explain it is if you don't agree with them, you're crazy, right? How could you not think that this new world order they're building is amazing, right? Very, very similar to what they did in the Soviet Union, very similar to what they did in China. Basically, if you're dissatisfied with the things that they're doing, if you're appalled by the things that they are doing, essentially you have something wrong with you. And they also use it. God has given each of us a conscience. So when we engage in things that are evil, when we lie, when we cheat, when we steal, we feel that something is wrong with that. We understand inherently that we have done something wrong, something immoral, and that causes us pain and suffering. And so the solution of the mental health establishment is, drugs, or, we'll talk you out of the feeling of guilt that you have as a result of your sin. And, of course, that is very, very dangerous from the Christian perspective. God put those mechanisms in each of us for a reason, and what they're trying to do here with these mental health programs is undermine that. And you take it to the extreme, right? They now have basically conscripted the mental health industry with the LGBT movement to where mental health counselors are not even allowed to help a child deal with, for example, unwanted sexual attraction or gender confusion. They are required in many jurisdictions to affirm that and to reject anything other than that. And ultimately, it's moving in the direction of conversion therapy bans, where mental health counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists will be required to encourage these children to go through so-called sex changes, things like that. It's so dangerous all around, Jim, and we could do a whole episode just on that. But I would encourage people to realize this isn't like, your child's stressed out and might need a little bit of help. This is actually a very nefarious agenda coming in under the guise of helping.
Friends, right after the break, too, we're going to be getting into what you can do. How can this be countered in such a time? And we invited this individual in. Alex, among her recommendations as well, involves SEL, social emotional learning.
Yeah, and social-emotional learning is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here with the mental health. Mm-hmm. Actually, SEL has essentially taken over education. The UN has a whole agency that's dedicated to promoting this. It's called the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education on Peace and Sustainable Development. And it's a very complex topic, but I'll explain it like this. Right? We used to have competencies like the child can understand this text, the child knows his multiplication tables, the child can spell at this level. What they do with SEL is they've reframed the competencies. So the new competencies deal with what they call the affective domain, which is your mindsets, your attitudes, your values. And so they'll create competencies like compassion or empathy, which sounds nice until you realize that they don't believe that if you believe in, for example, protecting the lives of the unborn, or something along those lines, well, you're not compassionate, you're not empathetic. So I hear the music, we can pick it up on the other side.
Alex Newman with us here today, friends. And again, we have the UN demanding the globalized education and thus take control over worldwide education. Back with more information and also what you can do. Following the break, you're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
For over 200 years, the American judicial system has upheld a standard so strong that a person's very life can be ended based on this level of confidence. A verdict supported by evidence that is beyond a reasonable doubt. Did you know there is evidence demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that we have a creator? Most are unaware of it because it has been censored from textbooks. Now, you can have this information at your fingertips. In the beautifully illustrated hardcover book, Have You Considered? Evidence Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, Bruce Malone and Julie Von Vett provide a series of unique devotions presenting evidence for every day of the year that points to the Creator. It's written in an easy-to-read format so that young and old can learn. Have You Considered is available for a donation of $18 or more from VCY. Call 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY American Network. With us today is Alex Newman. Alex writes for the New American and also heads an organization, Liberty Sentinel. Check out the sites, libertysentinel.org and thenewamerican.com, and get more information. Matter of fact, Alex drafted an article that was published on July 5. UN slams Trump on education, demands globalized control. That's our main topic here today, and there is so much engaged with this. But as we're talking about this rapporteur that came to the United States, examined our education system, coming back with many, many recommendations for the U.S. educational system. And by the way, a private school, you're gone. Homeschooling, you're gone. Needs to have this one-size-fits-all education. And Alex, we were just in the midst of talking about SEL, social emotional learning, in this, and the break kind of caught us right in the middle of it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jim, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak on this because, unfortunately, I'm finding even a lot of Christian schools now are starting to flirt with this idea of bringing SEL in as long as they sprinkle a few Bible verses on top. I want to make clear that this is a very, very dangerous program, and it's very easy to prove this, too. I did the first deep dive critical look at SEL about 7 years ago. And going to their website, the main website for the main organization that puts this out, it's called the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, or CASEL, funded by Bill Gates and the Rockefellers and the other usual suspects. On their history tab, they admitted that the idea for this concept and even the term social emotional learning came out of a meeting that was held at the Fetzer Institute. The Fetzer Institute is a New Age organization founded by a disciple of Alice Bailey, who was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. And their goal was always to inject what they describe as spirituality back into the education system. But, of course, not spirituality that we as Christians would understand, but rather this New Age, occult, Luciferian spirituality. And they have since taken that provision down from their website. But it's very easy to document all this. Another interesting data point that I think would alarm most Christians is the leading luminary behind this, and Fetzer actually refers to her as the leading individual behind social-emotional learning, is Professor Linda Lantieri at Columbia University's Teachers College, which is by far the most important college of education in the world. I have her on video, Jim, admitting that she's getting a lot of her ideas from what she says. She says, well, I hate to say that she's passed because she visits my council table every night, so let's just say she's gone to a different dimension.
Oh, my.
I know she's talking to dead people, or what she thinks are dead people, and for those who haven't been reading their Old Testaments, this is called necromancy. God calls it an abomination. He puts it right in the same list as people who are sacrificing their children to demons. It is something that is absolutely off limits. But, of course, it is thoroughly interwoven into this entire socio-emotional movement.
Friends, there's much at stake with this. And Alex, where does this go from here? Who did she make the report to, and what happens at this point?
So her report was addressed to the UN Human Rights Council and also to policymakers in the United States. And what they're hoping is that this will pressure policymakers in the United States and pressure the international community to move us further along in this direction. So my guess is Trump is probably not going to read this report and say, oh, well, I guess we better comply with the UN. I don't think Donald Trump is going to be doing that. But if you're a left-wing governor of a Democrat-controlled state with a supermajority of Democrats in the state legislature, there's a very real chance that you'll read this and say, we should try to do what the UN says so that we can comply with our obligations under the various international instruments that are listed in that document. At the same time, the UN Human Rights Council can then use this as a pretext to further demonize the United States. And we see this regularly. The UN Human Rights Council is a masterful organization when it comes to praising the murderous regimes of many of its members. They always have nice things to say about the regime in Iran, the regime in Saudi Arabia, the regime in Cuba, the regime in China. But when it comes to Western countries with Christian traditions, they always have nasty things to say. And so this kind of helps the UN demonize the United States as the bad guys who aren't complying with human rights, while the wonderful leaders in China and Iran and Russia are doing such a good job on human rights. But ultimately the goal, Jim, is to bring American public schools more deeply under the control of the United Nations, and that's what it will be used for.
Well, I don't believe her policies are going to have sway, as you mentioned, in the Trump administration. But if that administration changes, Alex, I mean, we have seen, some of these globalized programs come under, Republican presidents as well.
We absolutely have. And Donald Trump is kind of the exception to the norm here. But a lot of these UN instruments that are talked about by the UN in terms of why we need to comply, these came under Republican presidents. In 1992, we had the Agenda 21, where Chapter 36 deals exclusively with how education needs to change the attitudes, values, beliefs of our children. So these things have been very bipartisan. And what we will see is a continued move in this direction. Again, Donald Trump probably won't be the one to do it. In fact, he's actually right now considering whether to withdraw from UNESCO, which I think, he did it during the first administration. Ronald Reagan did it before him. So there's an established precedent for doing that. But eventually we'll end up with another Republican or Democrat sympathetic to these ideas, and they'll say, wow, we're not complying with our supposed obligations under international human rights law, and they'll start implementing some of these recommendations. So we need to be very aware of this. And I should add, too, Jim, we didn't mention it, but the UN has what they call the World Core Curriculum. The UN's own leaders have said that should be taught to every child in every school in every country. And this is a comprehensive global educational program. And the guy who wrote it, Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller, who's often called the father of global education, he admitted in the foreword to the teacher's manual that it was based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, who was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company, and the Tibetan Jewel Kuhl, who was a spiritual entity that Alice Bailey claimed to be channeling. She referred to it as an ascended master, but of course Christians would recognize this if they study their Bibles as a demonic entity of some kind. But to have the leaders of the UN promoting something like this for every child in every school in every country ought to trouble us greatly.
Friends, let's open our phone lines here. Our number to crosstalk, 800-733-9829. Your questions or brief comments here on our topic today, 800-733-9829. Alex, can this be stopped?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there have been a lot of efforts to stop it, and Donald Trump, as Farida Shahid herself pointed out, has been moving the United States in the opposite direction, maybe not as fast as some of us would have liked. But I think at the moment, at the individual level, it absolutely can be stopped. Almost every parent in the United States right now has the ability tomorrow to say, I'm not sending my child back into these schools. I'm going to homeschool him or her. I'm going to find a good, acceptable Christian school where he or she can be educated. So right now, on an individual level, we can be faithful to what God has called us to do, which is disciple our children in the fear, discipline, nurture, admonition of the Lord. And we can do that with help. I've got my own children enrolled in classical conversations one day a week, so we do that, and then another day a week we do a co-op. This is something that an individual family can right this moment protect their children from. But over the long term, the big picture, will the UN keep centralizing control over education and continue to indoctrinate the young people of this planet? It's an open-ended question. I don't know right now, but they're certainly making great progress.
Again, friends, our phone number to Crosstalk today, 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. And Alex, President Trump he's given the green light now, to dismantle Department of Education as we know it. Supreme Court has cleared what legal hurdles were there at the time, and this is not setting well with this group at all. And in this report that you wrote on this topic, you said this individual from the UN claimed that this would hurt low-income students, weaken civil rights, disrupt higher learning, and produce other alleged horrors. What are you meaning by that?
Yeah, and she acts like getting rid of the Department of Education would be this catastrophe where poor children would not be getting a proper education and civil rights would not be respected. I would encourage anybody to use some critical thinking skills here. Has the education of children gotten better or worse since the federal government has taken on more and more responsibility when it comes to education? And any honest assessment of the situation will reveal that all of those things have gotten significantly worse as the federal government has gotten more active in the educational realm. Our children have gotten dumber and dumber and dumber with every year that passes. Less than 1/3 of them are even proficient in any core subject, according to the federal government's own data. So we already have a catastrophe on our hands. It's hard to imagine how it could possibly get worse. But she wants us to believe that if Washington, D.C. were to quit dictating curriculum and standards and micromanaging our schools, that things would get worse. I find that very implausible.
Indeed. Let's go to the phone lines. We've got Jim calling from Wisconsin. Jim, you're on the air.
Yes, gentlemen. A very obvious question I have is, can you guys list one good thing that United Nations is for our country? And then on top of that, why are we not defunding the United Nations, period?
Thank you for raising that. Alex, can you name one good thing the UN has done?
I honestly cannot, unfortunately. I would like to say I could think of something, but I can't really think of anything that they have done that has benefited our country. And as for why the United States is not defunding it, I think that's a very good question. Mm-hmm. It's a question that people ought to be asking their members of Congress. There is a bill in both houses of Congress right now called the Defund Act, which actually does more than defund. It's called the Disengaging Entirely from the United Nations Debacle Act. And that would not only defund the UN, but it would get us out of the UN. It would remove their headquarters from American soil. I know support is growing very rapidly among Americans for that, and I know support is growing in Congress for that. So we'll see. But my guess is if the UN keeps pushing on these issues, they're going to find more and more resistance.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
We've got Tom in Virginia, Minnesota. Tom, you're on the air.
Hello, Jim and Alex. Thank you for your show today. And I didn't catch the whole thing, but the little bit I did catch, I just finished a book by Gary Codd, The Demonic Roots of Globalism. Mm-hmm. And it goes into the, beginnings of that Helena Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and some of those people. And it is definitely very frightening. And to think that's being pushed on our children and our society is quite frightening. So, Alex, thank you for exposing a lot of this. And we'll pray that it doesn't advance.
Tom, thank you so much. And Alex, let me just kind of point out with that many people think, well, it's, everything was fine back when I was a student. It's just, the last several decades that things have kind of turned. But really from the outset, there were those, and you and I interviewed on that here on Crosstalk, from the outset, there were those who were really wanting to take control of that young person's mind and remove parental authority really from the get-go.
That's exactly right, and thank you to the caller. Actually, my latest book on education, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. I start in Chapter 1 with the guy who first seriously proposed that the government ought to be educating our children. He was a Welsh utopian by the name of Robert Owen, and he claimed, by his own admission, he was fighting what he called the Great Trinity of Evil. That Trinity of Evil was marriage and family, private property and religion, in particular Christianity. And just a few months before he died, he admitted in a speech he gave at the Congress of the Advanced Minds of the World in 1857 that he was getting a lot of his ideas through Ouija boards from spiritual entities he thought were dead people. So we have this thread running through the so-called education, at least the government takeover of education, going back 200 years, where literally doctrines of demons are at the core of so much of what's happening. So you're right, Jim, this is not new, and I would encourage Christians especially to really pay attention, really pray about this, because this is one of the most important decisions you will make for your children.
Friends, again, Alex's book is called Indoctrinating Your Children to Death, and you can find more info on that, libertysentinel.org, other sources as well. Back in a minute here on Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewtube.com. Recently, perhaps you heard the headline, Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, put out a letter stating that he is going to reciprocate with restrictions on visas for Jews coming to America if the harassment of evangelicals by the visa department in Israel doesn't end. What? This seemed very odd. So we asked our reporter on the ground in Israel this week, Aaron, about it. And he said, oh, yes, this has been a problem going on for years. There are many Orthodox inside our interior ministry that are specifically targeting evangelicals and even Messianic Jews that want to come and live permanently in Israel. You see, folks, what this is a group, a small group, that do indeed go very hard after Christians. So we need to pray for them. But also, don't let this news story be used by people for anti-Semitism. Explain it's a specific group of people, not all Jews.
Alex Newman with us today on Crosstalk. Our phone number is 800-733-9829. That's 1-800-733-9829. As the UN is demanding globalized educational control, I even sent a representative here at the Biden administration request to come examine our educational system. And so they did, and came back with a stem winder of a report that would do such a wonderful job at turning our children into globalized citizens of the world, totally antithetical to what Scripture teaches. Again, 800-733-9829. Let's go to Fort Myers, Florida, and Vincent is calling. Hi, Vincent. You're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to say, first of all, I was born and raised in a democratic state, and I was not proficient in reading until the 11th grade. I sat in the classroom. Now, I was in school. I graduated back in 76. I sat in the classroom with other kids that I sat there, and they couldn't read no better than me. One of them was getting ready to graduate, and he couldn't read barely cat in the hat. And I'm 100% for getting rid of the education system, giving school choice, and forgive me for saying it this way, any black person that will continue to let their kids go to these democratic schools and just put us out, unable to do anything but just go to prison. And it's a crying shame. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. Alex, what he was talking about is pretty tragic.
It really is. And actually, in my previous book on education that I wrote with Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, we published this in 2014, we've actually got 2 chapters on how the people who really created this education system, a lot of John Dewey's associates, were blatant eugenicists. They had a very poor and very racist opinion of black Americans. And so a lot of the things that we're seeing now being done to all Americans in these government schools were first pioneered and experimented on in schools that predominantly served the black community. And it is a crime scene. I mean, that's actually the premise of our book, that these are actual crimes that ought to be prosecuted. And so I think the caller maybe even inadvertently hit on a very profound truth, that the things that are being perpetrated here against our children and against our country are literally crimes, and we should not be tolerating that, especially when it comes to our own children.
Our number is 800-733-9829. Marvin in Berea, Kentucky, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I would like to say that I live in a state that's got a Democratic governor, and the education system here in the state of Kentucky is sad, very, very, very poor, for the simple reason there's a generation that is past the 8th, 9th, and 10th, 11th, 12th grade that can't even read cursive writing.
Mm.
And it's very, I'm really glad that the Bible is printed instead of written in freehand, because if it was in writing, a lot of the people couldn't even read the Bible. This generation, it's so sad.
Yeah.
I think our educational system is very, very poor. God bless you, and I appreciate your program, sir.
Thank you for the call. Alex, is there a purpose in not teaching cursive writing or to keep young people from being able to read that?
There absolutely is, and I think the purpose was actually first hit on by our ancestors, our forefathers. The very first education act that was ever passed in North America was in 1640s. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. This was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the premise was one of the chief projects of that old deluder Satan is to keep men from knowledge of the Scriptures. And so in light of that, they said everybody needs to read so they can read their Bible, so they can not be deceived by Satan, so they can know God. And I believe that is why we now have, if you look at the federal government's data, about half of American adults are essentially functionally illiterate. That's the federal government's own data. That was by design. It was on purpose. We know the mechanism that they used to do this. And I believe the primary reason for it was to keep men from knowledge of the Scriptures so that they could be deceived.
Bill in Blue River, Wisconsin, you're on the air.
Yes, Alex Newman and Brother Jim. I was always under the impression that UN stood for United Nations, but now I'm kind of thinking that it stands for unnecessary. Thank you, guys. Bless you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you for the call. I'm sure you agree with that, Alex.
Absolutely, and worse than unnecessary. It is unfortunately a source of so much evil in the world today. I really hope that the American people will wake up to these facts, speak with their elected officials, and really try to change the direction here, because we're financing a lot of this evil, and it's not just hurting our people, it's hurting the whole world. So we have an obligation here, I think, to speak out and to say no.
We have Laura calling from Hollywood, Maryland, and Laura, you're on the air.
Good afternoon, Jim and Alex. I think it's just history repeating itself. It's go back to the, when of the Tower of Babel. United Nations is resurrected, and the reason they want to get into our children's education is so they can control everything, and they don't want educated children that can read and write cursive, or let alone write anything, because they don't want them knowing even how to read their own founding document.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A good point. Laura, thank you so much for your call here today as well. Alex, you used the C word, control. Is that what this is all about?
I think it is, yeah, and you hit on something important, too. The UN will tell you that they're using this education system to turn your children into global citizens, world citizens. And what they need to do for that is to get us to abandon biblical values and embrace these new values. But God's Word is so full of warnings here, right? Friendship with the world is enmity with God. It was God's design to divide mankind up into nations. Deuteronomy 32, Acts 17, over and over and again, God tells us His design. And so the people who are waging war, not just on nations, but also families and morality and the church, they're clearly engaged in what I would call evil. So they want to control our kids, they want to manipulate our kids, and they want to prepare them for this diabolical new system. And we as Christian parents have to say no.
And friends, just a reminder, as Alex pointed out, the legislation's been introduced both in the House and Senate really to get us out of the UN, and you can just reach out to your member of Congress, House and Senate, reaching the switchboard at 202-224-3121 or 225-3121. Alex, as always, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, Jim.
And friends, again, to learn more on this topic, follow Alex. He is watching very carefully the moves by the United Nations. He writes at thenewamerican.com and also libertysentinel.org, and looks specifically for this topic on the UN slamming Trump on education demands globalized control. God bless you, friends. Thanks for joining us on Crosstalk, and let's remember our biblical mandate to bring our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.